Ms. Prema.
Thank you very much, and permit me first to thank the Minister and the government and people of India for hosting this conference of the party at this auspicious venue here. Permit me to put probably matters of the post-2020 into context. Next week, we'll begin the formal negotiations of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And we have a working group which was established by the last conference of the parties to lead that process under two co-chairs. The first meeting of the working group, which was held last year in August in Nairobi, had identified certain parameters which ought and now guide the development of the post-2020. And some of the parameters which were set was the post-2020 framework will build upon and also take lessons learned from the current biodiversity strategic plan as well as the Aichi biodiversity targets. It is expected to be a simple framework, simple document, transformative, and not to have more targets than what are already in the Aichi targets. Aichi, we have 20 targets. Yeah. So already the parties have decided they do not expect more targets. I'm saying this, there have been proposals in the questions whether we should have a specific target on migratory species or not. So taking that into context and also knowing very well that the Global Biodiversity Framework is a framework and not the actual we'll say the action plan. It's a framework which will guide parties and all stakeholders to develop or to consider more specific actions at national level, regional level. So it's a framework to guide countries in the future work, and not that the framework will provide all answers we might wish to have. Having said that, the zero draft itself is also a zero draft. It's not yet a draft or formal draft. We expect that the third working group in July in Cali, Colombia, by then we will have now a formal 1.0 draft, as it might be called, or whatever name. So the zero draft has come out of all the contributions and all the consultations which have taken place so far, and then bringing all that into a document. And to do that, then, please, we should not read the framework in the context of our eyes. I want to see wetlands reflected. I want to see regulated trade in CITES species reflected, or I want to read it and see migratory species reflected. If we do that, then we cannot have 20 targets. We will have more, and we will have the same difficulties we have had to fulfill and respond to the 20 Aichi targets we have. So when you look at, and I will not go into detail, connectivity, extinction of species are all already reflected in the zero draft. But we should not look specifically, as far as CMS is concerned, this is the word I would want. We'll need to read it in the context of also other interests and other aspects in the context of really responding to the direct and indirect drivers of biodiversity loss. So I thought this context will help us, and I will come out later then as we go to other specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Prema. And it is very important that if we are not able to conserve our biodiversity, we can't really conserve our species, and vice versa. Species are required for conserving biodiversity, and biodiversity is required for the sustenance of the different species. So I would like to now turn to all speakers with my new question. What kind of actions and commitments are needed to reverse the unprecedented species decline? You have just touched upon that, particularly for migratory species. Should post-2020 framework include a dedicated species target to address this trend? The ministers have slightly touched upon this important area, but I would like you to reflect upon this thing. Any one of the speakers would like to respond to this thing, Your Excellency, sir? Please.
Thank
What
you very
kind of
much.
actions and commitments are needed?
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here representing UN climate change. I'll be very brief. I think to answer and reflecting on your question, the one opportunity we have is the NDCs in the Paris Agreement, which are required, or the governments are expected to enhance and update in this year for the next period. So now is a great opportunity to include in those NDCs and require the governments to include in those NDCs much higher ambition in protecting biodiversity and reflection of the current trends which we need to reverse for migratory species. So this CMS COP13 comes at a very, very opportune time, and a call by CMS to the parties to ensure enhancement of their NDCs this year and reflect the migratory species, the protection of their habitat, of the corridors, would be an extremely important endeavor, and I would expect and hope that in the drafts that this COP will present to the CBD conference later will reflect that.
Martha Rogers, would you like to respond to this thing?
Yes, thank you.
This very important issue is about CBD as well as conserving wetlands as well as conserving species. So you are into this thing, so I would like you to respond to this very important issue.
Yes, thank you. And first of all...
That is actions and commitments.
Yes, so actions and commitments, as we heard, we're talking about migratory species, and it's very important that the framework also takes into account the habitats. We cannot have viable migratory species if we don't have viable habitats. And here, representing the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, which has 171 contracting parties, many of them are here, wetlands are a very important habitat for many migratory species of birds, of turtles, of mammals, etc., and fish, by the way. So it is really important to take this into account, and the framework already includes targets also for this type of ecosystems. And I wanted to mention that we speak very often about some ecosystems like forests, like oceans, which is really important, but I think, and our parties think, that it's very important to talk about and to give more emphasis to freshwater ecosystems. This is about water, which connect landscape, and which are very important in terms of the livelihoods of people and for migratory species as well. So in terms of action, conserve habitats and take into account the special role of wetlands, including freshwater ecosystems.
Thank you. I can relate to you because I have been into conserving a wetland and urban wetland in my city of Indore for last 25 years. I have been working on conserving a wetland, and it took me more than 20 years to secure that because of the pressures of human populations and other things on that particular wetland. So conservation of wetland for conserving these species it goes without saying that if you don't conserve the wetlands, if you don't conserve water bodies, how can we especially conserve the birds? But my question again to my esteemed panelists is that post-2020 framework, does it include a dedicated species target to address this trend, or we want to go general about conserving all species, or we should have dedicated species target? What would you like to have to say this thing? The question is again, what kind of actions and commitments are required, and would you like to favor a dedicated species target to address this trend? Any one of you?
Okay. Thank you, and of course...
You're all very esteemed speakers for us, and you are the specialist in your respective areas. So whatever you say is very important for the conference.
Thank you. And firstly, of course, I'd like to thank the Government of India for hosting the CMS COP. Also thank the CMS Secretariat for inviting CITES to be here at the high-level segment and discuss a little bit about post-2020, but also I think very importantly about the cooperation that we have between us. Many of us as convention secretariats are working closely together. Let me mention firstly the Biodiversity Liaison Group, which most of us are a part of sitting here at this, on this podium, that we are cooperating and we have been influencing and trying to get our points across to what we would like to see in this strategic, in the post-2020 biodiversity strategy. But I agree with Elizabeth that we have to be very careful that it can't mention absolutely everything. What we do have to be able to say is that we will see a change in species in the problematics that we are seeing right now, particularly what IPBES has announced that we are going to go through some major extinctions in the next decades. So what we have to do is to be able to measure how successful we are after implementing such a framework. So I think a lot of it also has to do with the indicators that we choose and our own visions that we have all developed, the strategic visions that we have developed within our own conventions, that we make sure that this feeds into the framework and that it shows how the different conventions are cooperating together or working on their own to be able then to implement the framework. So as long as it says something about how we want to avoid the loss of species, and it doesn't have to be anything specific, but that we can all then use our own strategies to be able to obtain that, looking at the indicators and then how we can contribute to show that we are making progress. On the other hand, I think that some of what was mentioned by the ministers earlier, and I really agree with much of what Mr. Jochen Flassbart said, also the Croatian minister, the Indian minister, that we have to put people at the center as well. We cannot forget about people, that livelihoods depend on these migratory species, on species in general. We cooperate very much with CMS because if we don't have the habitats properly taken care of, there will be no animal and plant species to be able to trade. So all of this is very important, and people need to understand what the value of biodiversity is. And I think this is very important also for the framework in general, more and more to be able to explain how do we benefit from nature, how do we benefit from keeping nature in good state, because every day our livelihoods depend on it. I think from the World Economic Forum there was a figure of 75% of industry and business depends on biodiversity. So these are important things that we need to communicate to others and then put forward that again, as with the Sustainable Development Goals, that this is for social, there are social impacts, there are economic impacts, as well as environmental impacts. And I think that this will help get involved those other sectors who have not been involved with us in the past. Industry, for example, agriculture, forestry, absolutely imperative that they become a part of this work on implementing the strategic framework. Thank you.
Thank you. But as you know, the minister, Mr. Babul Supriyo, had referred to this point. In India, we had a targeted species of tiger conservation, and the tiger population has doubled in the last couple of years because of the systematic and scientific conservation methods adopted by successive governments. So India is now the leader in tiger conservation, and because of tiger conservation, many other species have also been saved. So Mr. John, would you like to comment on that? That do we really need a dedicated species target to address this trend?
Thank you very much. I think one of the great things of the CMS convention is that it's one of the, I think the only convention that's connecting species with their habitat. You have a list of species, Appendix 1 and 2, but when they're on those appendices, you have an obligation to look after their habitat, either conserve or restore. And I think the main thing is making that connection that's made so effectively under this convention. You can't look at species in isolation, you can't look at habitat in isolation. Bring the two together, as you've just said, with the tiger, its habitat, its cross-border, then I think we can make some success. And perhaps the current draft is lacking a little bit with that connectivity between place and species.
Amy, would you like to say something on that? I'll keep bringing you into discussion every now and then.
Well, thank you. I actually agree very strongly with what John said, which is, and this is we do think there should be a species target. There is language in the Zero draft about species, but we think it could be stronger and clearer, and especially in this point, which is it can't be isolated. There's also some habitat targets, but there's not really an understanding of how these relate to each other. And we have proposed some language, as I mentioned, it's in the documents that are available to this meeting, if you want to see our views on that.
And Rebecca, would you like to say something on this?
Sure.
Before I move on to the next
Thank you, Mr.
question.
Moderator, and Kim Chul, thank you very much to the Government of India for having us this week. What a
Thank you.
fabulous event for all of us to talk about these important issues. It's pretty obvious that whales migrate, and whales need to be free to migrate without blockages, whether it's a ship strike, a fishing net, or some type of underwater pollution. So we are pleased to be a part of this. We think it's important to underscore the migratory species and their special needs, and including their habitat. So we would like to ensure that the mandate of the International Whaling Commission be a part of what we're developing through this framework. Thank you.
Thank you. So there is another and more important question now that I am posing to all of you, because you come from different backgrounds and you are doing a lot of work through your organization at the global level. So the question is, how is the ecological connectivity relevant to the work of your organization? Is it sufficiently reflected in the zero draft? And I would urge upon you, all of you, to really respond to this question, because you all are working in different areas, but for a common goal. So over to you, Sir John. How is this concept of ecological connectivity relevant to the work of your organization?
So our organisation manages protected areas in 11 African countries, 17 protected areas, 13.5 million hectares. We are looking after a particular area, but it's embedded within a landscape. I think what's very positive about the zero draft, actually, Elizabeth, is that what we're doing is we're moving away from just looking at biodiversity conservation in isolation, but we're connecting it to the climate change agenda, the role of biodiversity and the role of biodiversity conservation in mitigating, adapting to and building resilience to climate change. The reference to the nationally determined contributions is key, but it's also linking to the Sustainable Development Agenda, which is critical. We've been good at setting goals and targets for the last 50 years, creating conventions. We've been lousy at implementing them, and IPBES has told us that.
Yeah.
We have to link to the climate agenda, we have to link to the Sustainable Development Agenda, and if we can do that, I think we're going to start getting some traction. The other thing is that 30 by 30 is great. 30% of land, 30% of sea by 2030 set aside. Again, we haven't had a problem as an international community setting land aside. The problem we've had is managing and financing it. And what we're lacking in the zero draft, which could be further emphasised, setting it aside is the easy bit. How you go and manage and finance a protected area into the future is the hard bit, because paper parks give us a false sense of progress.
Progress, yes.
So
Very-
managing and finance, and that's why we say link protected areas with their management and finance, including look at delegated management model, the link to climate, the link to development, we might make some progress. Don't just look at a number in isolation. It'll give you a false sense of progress.
Thank you. How would CITES as an organization like to respond to this question
Well,
about
firstly-
zero draft and CITES' role in that?
Yes, of course, with the ecological connectivity, as I mentioned before, in our cooperation with CMS, the parties have agreed that there will be programs of work, for example, on birds, on animals, of course, the big mammals that are iconic and charismatic. We're talking about saigas as well, where we have programs, the elephants. So in this way, we of course are supporting each other and reinforcing what needs to be done with those migratory species in order to keep their habitats intact, because the work that we do is all transboundary for both CITES and CMS. So ecological connectivity is very important also for CITES. In terms of the 30 by 30, and again, my concern is we have talked a lot about how we can set aside areas, protected areas, and these are very good, but I absolutely agree with John that the problem is that, and countries come to me when I visited, for example, Zimbabwe, and tell me the resources that we need, the conservation costs are enormous. And we as a country on our own, as the guardians of these species of both animals and plants, we do not have the resources that we need to be able to manage and finance effectively our areas. So this is something that I think is, before we used to call it means of implementation, but we can have a very nice framework, but if we don't have the financial means to be able to implement it, we're not going to get anywhere. So, and these investments, this is why we need to involve all stakeholders, because governments on their own, by themselves, cannot make these kinds of investments. We have to talk to industry, we have to talk to the private sector, find new ways of financing different activities, because otherwise governments alone cannot do it. The costs are tremendous for conservation.
all the countries are grappling with this problem, but I would like to ask Dr. Theresa to respond to that question about finances and about the need to amend the zero draft, if at all.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank, of course, the Government of India for hosting the COP, CMS, and this high-level segment. And of course, I'd like to thank the CMS Secretariat for inviting the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity to be here. As one of the high-level representatives who were here is, of course, our friend from Cambodia, who's a member of the ASEAN, and this is where we work within the region. The zero draft actually mentions about integrating species in the NBSAPs, and it's already actually in the zero draft. But the element of ecological connectivity, which is a question that you asked earlier, is also addressed when we talk about regional and international cooperation. Perhaps eventually in the work plans, this has to be acknowledged as part of the regional cooperation or multi-country cooperation. Each country in the ASEAN has their own NBSAPs, and we try to coordinate the preparation, the development of the NBSAP, as well as its implementation. And the added value that the regional body can provide, or the international bodies can provide, is to look at the connections geographically of all of these areas. For example, Cambodia has the Sarus crane, and also Vietnam has the Sarus crane. In fact, 20% out of the 20% that are found in the 3% area of the ASEAN, 16% are shared by the ASEAN member states among themselves and outside as well. So that means not one country can do the job of protecting the species. They have to coordinate, to cooperate, because the species are assigned, the migratory species are signs that you are doing well in the country where you are protecting it. Wherever they came from and wherever they go, they are indicators that the habitats that they pass through are doing okay. So this is something, the information exchange, the data sharing, the capacity building, we try to do it at the regional level, because then we talk about some of these experiences, and it allows us to maximize the resources as well.
Very true.
Yeah, so by working together, we are able to share the resources and maximize them, be able to counterpart the resources from each country, as well as from partners that are supporting the region.
Amy, would you like to respond to that? And then I'll go to Mr. Sarmat.
Yes. Well, I've already, of course, said that ecological connectivity is at the heart of what CMS does. But what I wanted to focus on is that the idea of just doing a protected area, in fact, the current strategy doesn't really talk about connectivity. It talks about protected areas. And the problem is, it doesn't really follow the natural ecological cycle. If you follow migratory birds, they show you where they go. They show you what they need to be protected. We need to see a better use of the concept of connectivity, which shows us, it maps for us what we need to be doing. Now, this is a really important concept, especially for very industrialized, developed countries in particular, or rapidly developing countries and expanding countries in terms of cities and so on, because it doesn't have to be a pristine area. For connectivity, in fact, I know in parts of Germany and other parts of Europe, birds will fly, and on their way, they'll rest somewhere. It might be in a farmer's field. That's fine. We need to make sure that we have a way to allow that bird to land there as they go on their journey. That doesn't mean that there can't be farming. In fact, when I used to live in Canada, there's a great example. There is a phenomenon of the snow geese that come every year on their way from the US all the way up to the Arctic. And they always stop just north of Montreal, up in Quebec, province, there are so many birds that come, and it's in a field, it's in a farm, and what happens is the winter ends, and the water starts to melt, and the birds come because they can feed on what is there at that time. They keep flying north, and the farmers farm their field. So it is a symbiotic situation. It doesn't mean we can't develop, it doesn't mean we can't farm, and it doesn't mean we need all pristine areas. We need to look at connectivity as a roadmap to actions that need to be taken, whether it's beautifully pristine areas, highly developed cities where we also see birds and raptors coming through, or farmlands and kind of transitional areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Mr. Sarmat?
Thank you very much. On ecological connectivity, what I'd like to share is, in a much broader concept, what we're talking about, the different conventions here in the podium, climate change, desertification, biodiversity, migratory species. What is needed is a very close and a delicate connection between all of those and the work programs that we are all responsible for, and setting very specific and concrete targets. And many of those already exist, and we now need to take action with a very robust engagement of all sectors, public sector, private sector, civil society, individuals, and a very clear strategy on messaging in terms of what we need to do and what is being done. And all of that has to be done in a very progressive and a proactive way to also highlight the opportunities and not just the threats. So this is extremely important, and the UN organizations that we all represent, we need to also make an effort to connect at much more interconnected way.
Yeah, please, Yvonne. I have not been able to come to you, but
Yes,
this
I'll
is
be
important.
very, first let me thank the government of India and the state government of Gujarat for hosting this meeting, and thanks to the CMS Secretariat. So from the UNEP perspective, UN Environment Program, we are quite keen to support the ecological connectivity for a couple of reasons. I think the previous panel articulated it very, very well, the dimension of needs for means for implementation. And as the highest environmental authority within the UN system, we actually see ecological connectivity as a unique opportunity for us to support both the zero draft and the parties, as well as the other conventions. Second, being UNEP and affiliated with about 13 conventions, these are our channels, if you like, where we can support their parties, their mandates to deliver on the ecological connectivity. But we would also like to emphasize, given that this is the decade for action, through sustainable development goals, this really is about people. It's about species, but it's really about, as John mentioned, species in the context of habitat to support the citizens. Thank you.
Yes, importance, the SDGs are very important, and in India also we are grappling with this thing and showing some success in removing the poverty, which is also directly connected to environment. So I would like to know, Mrema, what do you have to say about this?
Thank you very much.
Ecological connectivity remains the most important aspect.
It remains important, and out of 196 parties to the CBD, 129 are parties to CMS.
CMS.
In addition, when you look between the two conventions, CBD and CMS, 28 national focal points are common to both. And 72 national, of the 72 parties, we have the same ministries serving as focal ministries for both conventions. So not only that the cooperation is there, but since the negotiations are undertaken by the parties to CBD, who are all CMS parties to it, I believe then this conversation, the negotiators will be able then to carry forward and reflect, particularly beginning next week when the negotiations on the zero draft begin in Rome at FAO. So I think that's where it will be important. Amy underlined that yes, connectivity is reflected, but probably not so clear, need to be strengthened. I'm not objecting that, but this is where now the negotiators need to carry this forward. CBD
So
Secretariat will only be messengers.
I would definitely like you to make more suggestions so that the draft can be more purposeful. So you please go on and say whatever you feel like. Your
No,
opinion is very important for us.
Yes, correct. But at the end of the day, the negotiators will determine the way
Yeah,
forward.
of course.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I move on to the next question, which is also again very important in the sense that what kind of policies can reduce the potential impacts on migratory species from government and private sector decisions? Does the zero draft adequately cover such drivers? Please, Rebecca.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The national, the regional, the multinational, international policies must call on monitoring and mitigation of human activities. In the end, that's very important. Their impacts on these migratory species and on their habitats. It's very important, as we heard from the ministers and ambassadors in the initial session, it's really important that that's science-based, but that it's multi-sectoral. And the minister from Saudi Arabia mentioned the importance of social systems and including all of the actors. That's how we get people on board. When we want to have these populations recover, we need to look at all the sources of impacts. How can we find a way forward? How can we make sure that when we're quantifying the costs and the benefits, we include all of the costs and the benefits, including those non-market benefits? We hopefully we'll have an opportunity to speak about a collaboration between CMS and IWC looking at the ecosystem functioning contributions of whales. That is a pretty important phenomenon, and we're looking forward to the workshop that we're co-hosting with CMS. Thank you.
Thank you. John, Mr. John, would you like to supplement, complement, or object to what she says?
No, great intervention. Ultimately, biodiversity conservation is all about people. And it's people that are living within and amongst wildlife. Sometimes they benefit from it. Sometimes they're experiencing conflict and hazard from it. To somebody living in Mumbai in a unit, how do we as people relate to biodiversity conservation? Do we see it as something positive, something that's beneficial, something that's needed, or is it something that sort of you do if you get around to it, but it doesn't really matter? That's why I think what is so critically important of the zero draft, and I think what I like most about the zero draft, is the attempt to embed biodiversity conservation deeply into the climate agenda, mitigation, adaptation, resilience, and build it deeply into the Sustainable Development Goals. You will not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals if you trash your biodiversity. So you've got to get that connection. The other one is with nature-based solutions, which offers great opportunity, provided it is actually paying attention to biodiversity. You can plant out planet Earth with the eucalypt, and it's great for climate. Yeah, it's going to absorb all that carbon. You've just got rid of all your biodiversity. So again, the zero draft is saying nature-based solutions have to look at indigenous species to that area if we're going to get a benefit for biodiversity and a benefit for climate. This is the positive aspect of the zero draft that could really be even further emphasised. But this is where we need to be, because that relates to people and people's interaction with their own development, with the way we're responding to climate. If we can get there, then we'll make some progress.
Yes, conservation of indigenous species is very important, and I would like Amy to say something on that.
Well,
And I'll come back to you, madam.
okay. Well, in answer to your question about what can be done in terms of reducing the impacts of migratory species from government, private sector, the IPBES report talked about two kinds of drivers of biodiversity loss, direct ones and indirect. So the direct ones are things we know about, we think about usually, which are things like agriculture. So we know that's a driver, fishing, if there's too much of it, too much overexploitation. But behind that are really the drivers of our economies, and this is the indirect drivers. And the broad socioeconomic trends includes population growth, and includes the profit loss models that we have. It includes things like subsidies that cut across. And what's key about this is that is really at the heart of it. It is at the heart of what's driving not only biodiversity loss, but climate change. It's about the lack of proper accounting for externalities. If we think that the environment and the pollution, we can just do that for free. So that is really at the heart of it. And I truly believe that if we don't address that effectively, whatever gets agreed in the zero draft will be not sufficient, because we're only addressing kind of the back end. It's kind of like when I heard yesterday at our stakeholder forum, many people in the local communities in India are working to try to protect species, but I feel like they're working against the tide. They can only do so much if we don't address the things that are bringing the problems. That's the message. So just one other point on this, in terms of some specifics, a good example is infrastructure. And India has been a leader, and we've just heard that Croatia is also doing this, on looking at how you can build infrastructure, but do it in a smart way. Do it so that you think about where you're putting your roads, and you try to minimize the impacts on species, and there are ways to do it. Another example, just my last point, energy. We all need renewable energy to combat climate change. But we have found that it can actually be fatal to migratory birds. There are ways to handle that. We have an energy task force at CMS that looks at how do you site windmills in a way that maximizes wind energy but minimizes the impact on species. So it's about developing smart, and it's about thinking about these issues when you start to do your national economic planning to put these kinds of investments, infrastructure investments into place.
So thank you very much, Buttercup. We have raised this very important issue about the infrastructure, because India is actually grappling, and people are putting pressure on the government in India to create the highways and bridges in such a manner, as you rightly said, the smart manner, so that the wildlife is conserved and is not put to any danger. And there are a lot of issues about wildlife. I'll come back to that. But Madam Martha, you wanted to say something on that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, so I think the other members of the panels have mentioned the important connection between biodiversity and our lives. So it's that biodiversity is not only a question about species and about charismatic species, but that it matters to people. And we have so many examples that show that. And we talked about the importance of biodiversity for food, for disaster risk reduction, for water, etc. And I think that it's making these connections and having policies that integrate biodiversity, including wetlands, into these decisions that we are going to make a difference. And here, I wanted to emphasize that the SDGs really made a big change in terms of the environmental discourse. Many of us who have been in the environmental sector for many years were discussing about sustainability among ourselves. Now, sustainability is part of what all sectors are considering, including the private sector. And I think that this is a great opportunity in which the post-2020 biodiversity framework is going to allow us to go deeper in terms of how biodiversity is part of that. And for example, we are talking about public policy, but the private sector is very interestingly engaging also in this regard. And I was for World Wetlands Day with a meeting in Danone and other French companies. And it's very interesting to see how companies are moving from looking at sustainability as corporate social responsibility to making it part of their business model. So they are working, for example, Danone, in terms of getting water sustainability as part of their own targets, as well as carbon neutrality. And now there is a new coalition also working on how corporate sector can become more sustainable in terms of biodiversity. So in terms of getting deforestation as part of the supply chains, out of the supply chains. So I think that there are very big opportunities in terms of getting these decisions better for biodiversity. And just to finalize, I wanted to reflect on coming back to migratory species. The Convention on Wetlands has regional initiatives as part of ways of cooperating among countries. And one of them is the Amazon Regional Initiative. We often think about the Amazon as the big forest, but this is one of the largest freshwater ecosystems. This is a network of rivers. And it's very interesting because the 8 countries were working about migratory species, so fish. So 80% of the commercial fishing in the Amazon are migratory fish.
80%?
So how can they work together to conserve these fishes from mining, from infrastructure? But this is about livelihoods, not only about the species. So it's how can we work together, looking at migratory species, looking at biodiversity, looking at working together also for people and livelihoods. And I think that this is by connecting these dots that we're going to be able to have decisions that are good for biodiversity.
Thank you. You have raised a very important point that the involvement of the private sector is very important. And yesterday, if you were there, I think, in the stakeholders meeting, some of the Indian NGOs and community-based organization has raised this point that they have actually, perhaps in Uttarakhand or some other place, I don't know whether the person is here, but they have given the wetlands and water bodies to individuals to look after them, because that is the way, this is a smart way of conserving, because the government cannot do everything, and they have shown a model within India for conserving wetlands and giving organizations, individuals, private entrepreneurs to look after one lake each. So that was what yesterday was, they were mentioning. You were there, I think. Did you hear that?
Can I just say that this morning we had a meeting with the head of the National Authority for India and the India government, and it was very interesting because they were mentioning how India is focusing on water, and as part of the water policy, because this is a priority. We talk a lot about climate change, of course, but water is a main challenge coming up. So what they are doing, and they were talking about the river Ganga, that they are for the first time taking into account all the riverine wetlands as part of the management of the water of the river, of the restoring of the river. They are taking into account all the wetlands along the river. So I think that this is another example on how to look at conservation as part of managing a resource that is vital for development.
Yes, River Ganga, which is our national river, touches millions of people's lives, and the Government of India has taken up a very, very ambitious project of Namami Gange, that conserving the river's entire stretch of about 2,500 kilometers. This is India's mighty river, and everyone is watching what is going to happen to this river rejuvenation project, which is being talked about in entire world, because this is such a big project has not been undertaken ever by any other country, barring maybe Germany. But that is what we are all talking about, conserving River Ganga. Dr. Teresa, you wanted to say something?
Thank you. And speaking of rivers, there are also opportunities for learning for cross-regional learning, because in the ASEAN, we also have the Mekong River, and there's the Irrawaddy dolphin that goes through the river that is shared by Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. And there are so many communities as well that are living around the Mekong River and depend on the fisheries that are in the Mekong. So it is always, by working together, it will also benefit the communities. You have the certain species that you can use as your indicators that you are becoming more successful in your efforts to protect this river ecosystem. On other policies, in the zero draft, for example, I think there will be opportunities to engage the other industries as well through the long-term action plan for mainstreaming, which is something that will become an element of the zero draft. And this is still something that's going on, the discussion for this, which will be eventually, we will welcome all the inputs from all the parties on mainstreaming. Transboundary cooperation is very important as well. This is the added value for really for taking into account the migratory species. In the ASEAN, for example, we are looking at species that are shared between two countries for opportunities for transboundary ASEAN heritage parks or transboundary protected areas. Elephants and tigers, this actually was also mentioned earlier in the high-level segment where we have India and Bangladesh that are cooperating to protect the tiger. And it is the same thing in the ASEAN. We have Thailand and Malaysia that are also protecting tigers and elephants, and it's important for both countries to work together to be able to protect those iconic species. And then Amy mentioned some other ecosystems. We're not just talking about forest or pristine areas, but in the ASEAN we have the Singapore, for example, that are already mainstreaming biodiversity into the city development. And this has actually already attracted hornbills and other important fauna that you usually don't see in the cities, but because of mainstreaming or greening the cities, you are able to experience that corridor effect where you have, forest in Malaysia and you have city in Singapore, and they are now coming up with measures that will allow the species to be protected wherever they go in any of the countries in the region.
Thank you. And you spoke about corridors, and you may be knowing that in India we are trying to conserve about 100 such corridors which are well within Indian territory, but to protect the Indian heritage animal of elephant. So the corridors are very important for the species, whether they are within one country or whether they are transboundary corridors, but they are all required to be conserved by all of us. That's why we are here. So thank you very much for your observation. Anyone else would like to say something on that?
I would like to go back to what you were asking about policies, because I think this is very important, and also looking at the framework that will be coming out very soon, when we talk about implementation of the conventions. And I think that at the end of the day, we have to have a very strong message within the framework that countries, parties must really fully meet the obligations under each of the conventions. All of those related, we're talking not only the biodiversity ones, but we've also, UNEP has also been encouraging us to work with the chemicals conventions as well. So trying to find a way in which we can find areas in which we can work together. So there's that part, I think, that's very important about the implementation. Because at the end of the day, I think there is international cooperation. The international cooperation happens when we're meeting at the conference of the parties and the parties are taking these decisions. But once you go home, you have to implement those decisions. And I think that's, the countries have to meet their commitments. And this is the only way, and this is the disappointment that I think also Jochen Flasbart spoke about, that they had a lovely vision and a lovely targets and goals, but then the reality is when you go home, you have to implement that. I think that the countries, the parties are really the ones who should be the ones the protectors of biodiversity and should be the ones working on biodiversity. Of course, we help by coming together and working together on programs. For example, some of the programs, I think something interesting about the transboundary species, if you look at the way of focusing on a particular species, that is a way of bringing the range states together, because all of those who are involved with the care and conservation of that species brings them together. But at the national level too, the focal points, sometimes we have coincidences with the focal points, but sometimes we don't, and they need to be able to work together. I think one of the successful stories that we have from CITES is the work we do on combating wildlife crime. And we have this wildlife enforcement networks where different authorities like customs authorities, police authorities, the CITES management authorities are able to come together and communicate with each other. And it has helped a lot in terms of getting sharing of information and sharing of intelligence. I think if we do something like that also with biodiversity, where they have networks or some sort of mechanisms in which they can come together, there'll be better implementation at the national level, also through the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. But those of you, many of you who I've known for many years, we've been working on MBSAPs for a very long time, and it has been pushed that they should take into consideration all biodiversity conventions when they're working on them. So we need to work better with the parties to make sure that they engage everyone when they're developing those MBSAPs and updating those MBSAPs.
Indeed, the importance of CITES and the work they are doing in the different countries is very important, but what does UNEP boss has to say on this?
Well, it's great that I have my wonderful colleagues in the panel, but I was just reflecting, having been in Gujarat for 24 hours or so. we haven't really touched upon some good indigenous communities initiatives in this area. And just building, I mean, for example, in this state, there are some really community-based, most of them, some of them that we have seen are managed and led by women, and they're using very simple approaches to actually protect migratory species. So as part of peer-to-peer learning, which we heard from the previous panel, I think we also, at our levels, we need to learn. I would also like to give an example from UNEP, the African Elephant Fund, which we actually use to finance the habitats, African elephants in Africa. But a specific example for those who have been to Kenya, Masai Mara and Serengeti, Kenya and Tanzania, it's the same park. And the elephants, when they move, they don't really need passports, nor do they respect the geographical border.
No
but
visa,
there are
no
some
passport.
local African communities that have taken very simple initiatives, at the same time encouraging income earners, particularly women, but at the same time protect the elephants as they move from Masai Mara to Serengeti or vice versa. So I think we should not lose sight of important community initiatives that are happening across the globe.
So when I open the floor after some time, I would like one of the local Gujarat community-based organization to respond to what she is saying, because that is very important, because communities are doing a great job in different states of the country, but I'll come back to that afterwards. So here is another question, and I would like to move forward. How can the framework best recognize the role of your organization in the implementation of components related to your mandate? So this question is again very important for each one of you. So how do I start?
Thank you.
How can the framework best recognize the role of your organization in implementation of components related to your mandate?
So 3 points.
3 points?
The first
Very
one.
interesting. Please carry on.
So the first one is, and it does already, but it's really important that the framework is not the framework for the CBD, it's a framework for all of us and beyond. Because this framework should be and reflect how the biodiversity-related conventions can contribute through our mandates in a way that adds on to the collective ambition. And Elizabeth explained at the beginning, this is a framework, so it cannot contain all the details. But we need to make sure that when it comes to the framework addressing habitats, and for example, wetlands, it reflects what this convention is providing, and it's going to contribute in more detail. Because this is the way that we can join efforts. We should be, as conventions, like the armed branches or arms, that implement this collective ambition. So this is the first thing, is that this framework reflects what we can contribute. The second one is for our convention, and this is something that the parties have said, it is really important that the ecosystems that are most endangered are reflected perhaps in a stronger way. We talk about terrestrial and marine, and I know that this covers a lot, but it is really important to give more attention to freshwaters. Freshwater biodiversity is the most endangered today. I don't know how many of you know that we're losing wetlands 3 times faster than forests. People don't know that. And the biodiversity, and they contain 40% of all the species. And we're losing, in terms of species and in terms of the surface, more wetlands than any other ecosystem in the world. So it will be important that when having in the framework indicators about species types, which are already in the framework, there is one for this type of ecosystem. Wetlands also cover marine and coastal. So I know that the framework now has marine. It will be important to have also coastal reflected. So that's the second one. The third one, although the framework is not going to have the detailed list of indicators, this is an attachment, it will be important that when parties get to look at the indicators, that we use those that already exist. And that we use those that are relevant in our conventions, but also in the SDGs. And I mention this because resources are scarce and the urgency is big. So we should avoid duplication and not burden the countries in doing 2 or 3 times efforts to get to the same result. Unfortunately, this is happening. So, for example, the Wetlands Convention is co-custodian for an indicator on the extent of water-related ecosystems, and it is not yet reflected. So, in terms of the monitoring, the message is, let's have the same indicators so that they contribute, and in this way, we create really synergies and allow to have reporting that is consistent, helps country, we use less resources, we use them more effectively, and we are able to track resources. So overall is how can we all work together towards this common framework and make it work to turn the tide. Thanks.
Thank you. Since this question is about mandate of your organization and the components related to that, I would like each one of you to say something. So over to Mr. Sarman, and I'll take this route and then I'll come back to you, madam. I'm not going to leave anyone out of that.
Thank you very much.
Because this mandate is very important.
It's been an extremely interesting discussion. Very pleased to hear the different views. From my organization, UN Climate Change, we are very much focused on implementing the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is one of the biggest and the most powerful multilateral agreement that exists today in protecting the climate change impact and broader biodiversity and all the related aspects of climate change. So what we are focusing now is the implementation. We have the implementation guidelines of the Paris Agreement that were adopted in 2018, and now we need to release the full potential of that agreement. And in doing so, the other conventions that here in the podium, they have all a very important role to play. And here is my final point and a takeaway. What we are looking at is, although these conventions are negotiated and agreed upon in an intergovernmental environment, they are multilateral agreements, but we want to now make those agreements more inclusive. So we refer to as inclusive multilateralism, where not only governments, but private sector, civil society, individuals and businesses, everyone need to come together, because we have not much time to lose, and we need to implement each of the objectives, goals and targets of the conventions that we represent in a very, very expeditious and a robust manner. Thank you.
Yeah, Amy, you can respond to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, the first thing is the current strategy that's in place. It doesn't mention specifically the different conventions in terms of a role, but there's always been an informal cooperation among the different biodiversity conventions, absolutely. And I know, for example, CBD does not really have programmatic work on species, and they've always had arrangements with the other conventions. So we have a lot of cooperation. I do think it would help, though, to have a more formal recognition of that role somewhere included in the outcome of the post-2020 negotiations. And it's like a multiplier. Think of it this way. We already have, you see all the conventions that are represented here. We have our mandates. We have, a lot of work that we're undertaking. And so we can each contribute a piece of, or several pieces of what gets agreed. So for example, if there is some kind of target on either connectivity or migratory species or species, we can contribute to that. The second point on that is that I think it would be very helpful to better, and this is more of a conversation we need to have among actually those represented here, and we'll have an opportunity to do that very soon in Switzerland, where we're going to talk about how can we work better together to achieve the goals of the post-2020. I think we can do much better. I think we can really look at what are each of the strengths that the different mandates bring, and how can we make the most of that. And one of those ways, as I mentioned earlier, is through the NBCEP, through the national level implementation, to make it much more streamlined and coherent in terms of bringing all of the different conventions to bear on the same country and the same issues that are going on in a much more effective way.
Oh, thank you, Amy. So the same question to you, Ms. Joyce.
Yes, four areas in terms of the mandate of UNEP. I think one is what I would say the bread and butter of our organization, science to catalyze policy action. For example, we're working on the UN Decade for Restoration. We've heard the issue of land use. We have a program on oceans and marine litter. So basically our core mandate and this framework are absolutely aligned. Second, UNER, the UN Environment Assembly, which is the highest universal body for environment. We have a number of resolutions that have actually mandated us to deliver not only on biodiversity but also climate change. We're working very closely with UNFCCC and others, including the conventions in this area. We are in a very unique position. We are affiliated, associated with our 13 conventions, including the ones here. So again, that gives us quite important connections vis-à-vis this framework. And lastly, within the UN system, we are an agency that is supposed to coordinate the work of the environment through the Environment Management Group. So those are the 4 specific areas.
Very nice. Madam Marima?
Thank you very much. Indeed, without not speaking specifically for CBD, since it's obvious here, but probably to my colleagues here, for the framework to have teeth, we will need to have it implemented. And I know that the discussion here has so far been focusing on the content, what should be in the zero draft. We can have a very nice document and decorate our tables and shelves, but we'll need it to be implemented. And probably one question from me to my colleagues here, we are saying that the post-2020 framework will be different from the past, will be transformative, innovative, and all the buzzwords which goes into it. Can we, and of course, implementation is all of us, and I think Martha has underlined that as well as my colleagues. But that has been the case, even the current biodiversity strategic plan, where we had the biodiversity conventions and their governing bodies also aligning their strategic plans with the current biodiversity strategic plan. We also, one of the lessons we have learned with the Aichi targets, that it lacked the monitoring review mechanism, and therefore there was no accountability framework which goes with it. We hope the framework will have. That is not part of the zero draft because
That is not the part of zero draft, yeah.
It will still come later. But as part of the ambition and looking at high, can we look at the mandates of each of the relevant conventions, including the ones here, basically committing to taking the lead on those aspects of the framework which will be relevant to their own mandate, so that then they can review, they can monitor, they can report to their own parties, and by doing so also report, let's say, to our parties. So in which case then implementation will not only leave it to the countries, but then the countries will also work closely with their secretariats, and secretariats then doing that, the monitoring, the reviewing mechanism, and basically then support that implementation and report to the different mechanism without adding an additional reporting mechanism to the countries or to the parties.
Okay, thank you.
As part of that ambition.
So you would like to say something about this thing? Whatever she said, see, she has
Whatever
asked
she
a question. In fact, she has taken
Whatever
upon
Elizabeth said.
my role. I am asking question, but now she has started asking questions. So you may
Well-
like to respond.
Actually, I think it's very interesting what Elizabeth says, because definitely the implementation is up to the parties. I mean, we can do our work the best way we can, but the implementation is up to the parties. However, because there's been those decisions and the discussions that we've been having on, while the framework has been developed, about including the strategic visions of each of the conventions within that strategic framework, for which those strategic visions have goals and objectives and indicators that will accompany them. So we have that. We have exactly what Martha says when you spoke, is that why we don't need to have new indicators. Indicators exist. We have indicators for the SDGs that took years to develop. Let's use those same ones, and that way we will be able to report back on those areas that concern us. And the parties have said within at least for most of the conventions that I know, they are very interested in in reporting back and monitoring, because they'll be doing it anyway for those strategic visions and those objectives and goals that they have, which are very much aligned with Sustainable Development Goals, and we've been trying to keep abreast also with what's coming out of the strategic framework. But then again, you have to include it within the strategic framework. I think one of the biggest problems we have with biodiversity is measurement, and the monitoring, but also the measurement, later finding out if we've been successful. For some other conventions, it's very simple. Ozone Convention, for example, everybody says how wonderfully it's doing because you can measure by the ozone hole that's been closing, and you know already if the substances that cause the hole in the ozone are decreasing the production of those chemicals. But with biodiversity, it's very, very difficult. So we have to use what we already know, the indicators that we've developed, to be able to say something about progress. And then the countries will be able to say, yes, we have been able to progress in this area, we're still having gaps in these other areas, and then we have to do better, and we have the time to do better later.
Ms. Rebecca?
Okay, Yvonne already mentioned the Biodiversity Liaison Group. The IWC was happy to join that group just a couple of years ago, even though we're probably the oldest organization here on the stage. So that's an important part of our effort, is being woven into this as a group. And of course, it's up to our commissioners at the Whaling Commission to decide what they're going to commit to as the IWC and as individual countries. I'm happy to say that in this super year of biodiversity, we do have a commission meeting. Our chairman is here, and we will be meeting late September, early October, so it's perfect timing to have a good discussion amongst our commissioners about our commitment. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So John,
Thank you very much.
then I come back to you. Yeah, I'll complete this thing and just...
From the 8 years I spent in CITES, I don't think we have a problem with cooperation amongst convention secretariats. I think it's very strong, in particular through the Biodiversity Liaison Group. And having been around this space for a long time, I think we've been very good at creating a body of international environmental law, plans, strategies, targets. What is very clear, though, is that we're failing in the implementation. And I think we place a little bit too much emphasis upon synergies at a higher level. Rather, we should redirect that to the field level. Why is this failing in the field? Because ultimately, if it's not reflected and given expression in the field, it's been a complete waste of time. It's just been a great conference, but it never hit the ground. And to give you an example of, I'm working with African parks at the moment. It's all about implementation. Garamba National Park in Democratic Republic of Congo, we manage, it's on the South Sudanese border. That was a park that has been infiltrated by Lord's Resistance Army, killing people, killing wildlife, and really degrading that whole environment. It's now under effective management. We've got a good ranger force, both men and women, good engagement with communities. We're the largest employer in that place. We're going to put in tourism. We've now got a direct route going from Entebbe in Uganda directly into the park to make that easier. And we're also looking at how much carbon is being captured by this park now that it's well managed and has been rehabilitated, and how much of that carbon can we take to the voluntary market. Now what you see is if you can focus on a place, you get synergies at that place. And I spoke to the rangers there at Garamba Ranger Day and I said, you don't know it, but you're actually implementing the World Heritage Convention. It's a World Heritage Site. The Ramsar Convention, you have CITES and CMS listed species, you're protecting them, and you're actually also helping sequester this carbon. You're providing for adaptation and resilience. You're delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals because you're the largest employer in the region. You're about to start employing people through tourism, and you're also helping the DRC live up to its commitments, human rights commitments, because you've dealt with the instability in the region and the destabilising effect of the Lord's Resistance Army. To give you an example, there was 100 elephants being poached every year in that national park. It's down to 2. And I got 250 plus people employed through that park. So if we can start to focus on places, special places, and say, how do we synergize in the field, in that place, and demonstrate that we can give effect to this multiplicity of international agreements, whether it be the Rio Conventions, the Biodiversity Conventions, human rights or sustainable development, you can give it expression in one place at one time through one window. We can do it. I've seen it happen. So let's get the focus on the field and not just have the focus up in the global processes.
Thank you, Sir John. And Teresa, about mandate and your contribution to the framework,
Yes,
possibly.
thank you, Abidash. Actually, on what John mentioned, from the international level, and then you suddenly go to the field, that's actually our mandate is to bridge bridge the international with the national. As a regional body, that's the added value that we can provide. For example, for the CITES, we have the Chiang Mai Statement on Wildlife Enforcement. So it's already a coordination among the 10 ASEAN member states. So you try to look for commonality, how they can address certain issues as a group. So that is the support that we provide at the ASEAN level. We have an agreement already with the Convention on Biological Diversity as a regional node for protected areas, because in the end, the countries find out that some of the issues that the challenges that they face in their protected areas is similar across the region. And if we help them address those common issues, they share their experiences, the best practices, and that's the opportunity that we provide. And that now translates to better implementation in the field. So, and at the same time, you have, again, the coordination among the countries, 10 countries, if you are able to have some success in the implementation, then that feeds to higher success in meeting some of the targets. And for this framework, what we are trying to do now is not just to, we're no longer just thinking about becoming at the receiving end as a region, but we're trying to also participate more actively in shaping the post-2020 framework. And I think that's important for everyone. It's not, you know, this is a very good opportunity to lend your voices in shaping the post-2020 framework, because after all, you know, we cannot, after it is agreed upon, then we start to complain that we cannot implement it. This is, I think, for the ASEAN, we're already doing that, having certain consultations so that we can be more proactive in providing inputs into the post-2020 framework. And I think that would be the same for everybody, for all the parties.
Thank you, Dr. Lim. This is a very, very informative and very engaging discussion, but this is the last question, which you may find it a little, you know, a kind of a duplication, but still it is very important for me to ask all of you, how could the countries better reflect the commitments to various biodiversity-related conventions at the national level? So this is related to CBD, so I would like to go to Madam Nirma about the same question, and then I'll go back to all of them, and then after that, your opinions and your observations are heard. I will open the floor for the questions, and they will all be targeting you. But the question is again, how could countries better reflect the commitments to various biodiversity-related conventions at the national level?
Thank you very much. It has already been underlined here that success of the post-2020 framework will be implementation at national level. It is also clear that the National Biodiversity Strategic Plans, or NBSUPs, will still be the tool for implementation. We have also all underlined here that even currently, as the revision of the current NBSUPs had already, or as much as possible, also engage national focal points of the other biodiversity-related conventions, and also incorporated aspirations from the other conventions. I know CMS, for instance, had even developed guidelines to support their national focal points engagement into the NBSUPs process. So basically, we hope that process will even be further strengthened. And what we also hope, unlike the current situation, is that once the post-2020 framework is adopted, implementation at national level can begin immediately. It took us 4 or 5 years for the current biodiversity strategic plan and the Aichi targets to be implemented, because many countries went into either developing new NBSUPs or reviewing then the existing one. I hope we've learned lessons. NBSUPs are in place. They may need to be strengthened, but I hope we'll not take a step back to work on them first before implementation proceeds.
So this is very important
So-
because, you know,
I hope come January 2021, national level implementation, even using the current NB subs can begin immediately and no longer waste time, so that then we can count a decade and not a decade of 5 or 6 years. Thank you.
thank you, thank you. You know, India passed the relevant legislation for the Biodiversity Act in 2002. And after that, it took still many years to, you know, reach it to the district level, and where the biodiversity registers are to be maintained, some districts are still not able to do that. So biodiversity is really important, and we need to take it to the last point in the country. So sir, would you like to say something about that? About how countries better reflect the commitments to various biodiversity related conventions at the national level? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think the first point which somebody made on the panel is that it's a strategic plan for biodiversity, not a CBD plan. It's an inclusive plan, as the previous
It's
one
an
was.
inclusive plan, yeah.
The National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, I don't think have been a huge success to date, but they're the vehicle that we'll push ahead with. I think what critically has to happen, they can't just be a plan for biodiversity. If we're just looking at the family of biodiversity conventions and thinking about how we synergise as a biodiversity family, we're going to get nowhere. This has to link directly into the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, and has to link directly into countries' plans under the Sustainable Development Goals. The only way we will implement biodiversity commitments made under conventions is to link into climate and to link into sustainable development. Without that, we're going to be on the same road we've been on for too long, and we're going to be here in 10 years' time and wonder why we failed. Lock into those two through the MBSAPs, and we'll make some progress.
Thank you. Would you like to say something before I open the session for the audience? The last word, as far as this session is concerned?
Well, just on this last point, and linking this to implementation, I mean, I'm giving a lot of thought to what motivates people to take action, what motivates governments to take action. And actually, I'll just tell one little story from yesterday, which I was very touched by, which was the Amur Falcon. And it's a good story because you'll see where it goes. So the Amur Falcon, which actually the Honorable Minister was very involved with starting off this program, I heard yesterday the way that they convinced the villagers where this falcon was here in India to stop killing it, which they were doing, they were trapping them in the hundreds or thousands in nets, was to tell them that the people in South Africa were waiting for those birds to arrive so that they would eat the termites that were there in the fields so that they could then get rid of them as a pest. And so people just like them that were living thousands of miles away depended on these birds. And that touched their hearts, it touched their minds, it made sense to them. So I actually don't agree that we need to just link with climate change and the SDGs. I think we say that a lot, but I think we need to stand on our own 2 feet and make the case that this matters. Species touch people, and that's why CMS, I'm so certain that if we can elevate this and think about creative ways to get people to think. Remember, the IPBES report, what people took away was the million species threat. That's what hit their conscience, that's what hit their hearts and souls. Species, if we protect species, that means we have to protect habitats. If we're going to protect habitats, we have to look at climate change. We have to look at fresh water. We have to look at our neighbors. We have to work together. So I think that actually entering through the species lens is a very powerful tool in and of itself. Obviously, we need to work with climate. We have a lot of work to do in an integrated way, but I do think we also have to stand up and say, this matters, and here's why, and here's what we'll do.
Thank you, Amy, and thank you all the participants and speakers who have really enriched this debate this evening. And now I would like to turn to the audience for very few questions and no repetition from the earlier. There I can see that the person who had asked earlier, I would like to excuse myself, but yes, madam, you are from IUCN and you would like to add ask some question to
Thank
any
you
of
very
the
much.
speakers. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and
Good evening.
thanks very much indeed for this interesting
I'm running short of time, so
discussion. Yes,
the
I know, so
interventions
I will be brief. My name is Jane Smart from IUCN. I have a comment and a question, if I may, please. So turning back to the zero draft, I do want to congratulate the CBD because I do think that was a hard job to pull off, and then you had millions of inputs, and I think it's a good structure overall. In IUCN, we do agree that this needs to be a global biodiversity framework for all. For all the conventions, at international level and at national level, and for all stakeholders. So I want to pick up the comment made by our colleague from the Climate Convention, for cities, for youth, for indigenous people and local communities, for everybody who wants to contribute. And let's face it, if we're going to get there, everybody has to contribute. I do want to come back to this business of the species goal, because here we are in CMS. And there are many aspects one could touch on, of course. The IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, put together by many of my colleagues in the Species Survival Commission who are here at this meeting, you know, the figure in IPBES, the million species at risk of extinction, comes from the IUCN Red List. Now, there is a species goal in the Zero Draft. It's good. It's great that it's there. I think it needs a little bit of work, but we can work on that to get it right. And we all also have to make sure, and I want everyone to hear me on this, that the action targets sitting beneath that species goal will add up to achieving the species goal. Because if we don't do that, we fail. Now, the question I was going to ask the previous panel, right, was, will you commit to adopt and implement a goal for species that will halt the loss of species by 2030? But you're not those people anymore. You're not the ministers. Such a goal, of course, has to include connectivity, and it has to include action for freshwater, for marine, for the ocean, for coast, for all of it, otherwise it doesn't work. So my question to the panel is, how can we persuade governments to adopt and implement such a goal? Thank you.
So who would like to answer that and respond to that? Yes, please.
Thank you, and thank you for the question. It's a very important question to us, and I think what I had said earlier about ensuring that there's an understanding about the benefits that come from species, that come from nature to people, is the only way in that we're going to be able to motivate them to make a difference and to commit to this kind of a goal. If we think everything is free, that it's endless, and it will never, we can always have it for whatever it is that we need, we will not take care of it. So we will have to find a way to communicate that value of these species to the governments, to the ministers. And I think of course, the Indian minister referred to that, and also Amy, to how they were able to communicate to people that these species are important. We know that within CITES, we have been able to do it with vicuña, with crocodiles, and with others, being able to communicate to them that if these species were not maintained and supported, that their habitats would be converted to something else, to planting soybeans or to planting palm oil, that they would lose their incomes. And so and this creates jobs. This creates access and opportunities to health services, to education services. So this is the message that we have to be able to give the governments, so that they understand they're actually investing in their people when they invest in that and in committing to that goal on species.
Thank you, thank you. So I'm in a position to take only one question now from this younger man in the behind. Yes, please identify yourself and be brief. This is the last question of the session. I have to wind up. And before that, is there a mic there for him? You can come up and ask questions, please. वो पीछे खड़े हैं लोग.
My name is Dilip Singh Bayas. I'm from Maharashtra. The point which Mr. Khandekar shared about the implementation of biodiversity plans, I'm pleased to share that the last unit in the district, which is called a village panchayats in Maharashtra, there are many villages which has the people's biodiversity registers which are getting prepared, which is a comprehensive document about documenting biodiversity in the villages. Besides that, I would like to share 2 points. One is on if this zero draft has any scope to include the actionable knowledge management component to the overall, passing on this information on the migratory species to generations. And second, if there is any scope for introducing a community engagement framework in the draft. Thank you.
Amy, who would like to respond to this question? He has made a very important observation about a state that is Maharashtra, where the biodiversity registers are being maintained, but which is not the case in most of the districts. We have got more than 600 districts in the country, so we have to take it down to there. But his question is about the zero draft, so I think Amy would be able to respond.
Yes, I will try. as the zero draft was being developed, the party specifically had requested that first was to include contribution of traditional knowledge, indigenous peoples and local communities. And we have had specific thematic consultations for this group to ensure that then their contribution is included or are included in the zero draft. So probably, if not well inscribed, this is the time to further strengthen that. But we have had a separate process actually to get their specific contribution, independent from the other contributions from other stakeholders and parties.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So all good things have to come to an end. So I would like to thank all my honorable speaker. It has been a very enriching experience and a very great pleasure to moderate the discussions among you speakers today. I would also like to thank the audience for all of your presence and interest taken in this session, and also for your engagement in the discussions. I hope these discussions will inspire the negotiations of the coming days as well as the coming months leading to the adoption of global framework of biodiversity in the next decade. May I now invite the chair of this session, Shri Prakash Javadekar ji, to make his final remarks.
First of all, big round of applause for those who are present even now. I was skeptical about whether this format of having a panel discussion will work in this fashion or not. But I was wrong, and let me admit this was much, much better than the speech after speech after speech. So this was very good because people also participated and questions and answers were direct and to the point. And therefore this was all enriching. This is, I think, the democracy, where everybody participates to prepare the draft, and when everybody participates, it is expected that the draft so prepared will be implemented seriously. And therefore, thanks once again to everybody who participated as spectators and as participants, because many of them are good researchers, are NGOs, are activists, are experts. And the panel, two panels which discussed, the ministers and this expert panel, UN-related, all agencies together. This was very good. Now, we will end our thing and at 7 o'clock? Yeah. At 7 o'clock, we will meet in Gift City Hotel. It's yet another good attraction. Please come for Champions Night. And of course, reception. Thank you.
Thank you, Javadekar ji. Despite your bad throat and this thing, you stayed for a long time. I have no words to thank you enough. There is an important announcement for all the invited delegates. They are all requested to assemble at gate number 7, dedicated Volvo buses for transportation to the Gift City for your kind gesture to be here and your participation. Thank you very much.